The success of the Chinese Communist Revolution led by Mao in the late 1940s set the stage for China to play a huge role in the Cold War. Mao Zedong was a communist revolutionary who established and led the People's Republic of China. Mao was active in the Chinese government from the late 1920s when he led his country in a communist revolution till the year of his death in 1976. With the rising communism, China was seen as a major threat to the United States and a potential ally to the Soviet Union. In Mao's intermediate zone, he declared that he would lead the Third World in anti-US imperialism. Mao's intermediate zone thesis displayed the determination of the Chinese Communist Party to stand with the Soviet Union in challenging the United States. While the intermediate zone was focused on class conflict and economics, after realizing the power and influence of the Soviet Union, Mao shifted to the Three Worlds thesis. This shift saved Mao from having to fight two superpowers in the Cold War. The Three Worlds thesis divided countries by categorizing the First World as including the US and Soviet Union and of course China, the Second World consisting of Japan, Europe, Australia, and Canada, and the Third World as including Africa, Latin America, and Asian countries that are excluding Japan. Mao thought that the backwardness of the Third World countries would move forward international communism. He believed in the proletariats leading the communist revolution, and he did not see the Soviets as such. Throughout this discussion with our interviewer, our student Joey, and of course Mr. Chen Jian, the esteemed author of The Cold War and the Third World, we will discuss the evolution of Chinese policies, ideologies, and leaders as the Cold War approached and advanced. They will talk through the history of how the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Republic of China impacted the sequence and location of the Cold War.
Let's get into this discussion. So first off, Mao had strong opinions surrounding an intermediate zone. What does this consist of?
The intermediate zone refers to the middle Huput sky zone. So when you're little, you start on the smallest one to the left, and before you're tall enough to move on to the one at the right, you go to the intermediate zone.
I'm not sure if that's the answer we're looking for. We're actually discussing the Chinese Communist Party right now.
The intermediate zone refers to the countries that sit between the US and Russia and Asia, Africa, and Europe.
In 1950, Mao and Stalin safeguarded Chinese and Soviet relations with the Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance. What did this mean for Chinese and Soviet collaboration?
Wouldn't mutual aid mean that Chinese people donated groceries to Moscovians?
Huh? No. We are speaking about international relations regarding two of the most powerful countries. Mr. Chen, please share some wisdom with this kid.
Correction. Actually, this treaty improved the geopolitical relationship between these two countries. After this agreement in 1950, the two countries were supposedly aligned politically, military-wise, and economically. Therefore, the United States began to view China as a threat to national security because with China and the Soviet Union, two superpowers, were united in support of communism.
While China provided cheap mineral resources to the Soviets, the Soviet Union loaned China over $300 million and provided military aid. However, they were not in charge of the Chinese government. So what do you think this left room for?
This left room for
the Chinese government to breathe, to be free of Soviet domination.
I will admit you are right about the freedom and agency of the Chinese government. This, however, left room for a difference in the interpretation of communism, while Khrushchev was on a mission to de-Stalinize the USSR, which he officially announced with his speech on the code of personality and its consequences. Mao was literally emulating Stalin's practical application of socialism. In addition, Mao was initially against the peaceful coexistence with the West, which Khrushchev was proposing. The Communist Party of China went so far as to denounce the Soviet communism as the work of revisionist traitors.
Wow, so what did that mean for the Soviets?
The difference in the interpretation of communism became clearer and clearer to the point that the idea of monolithic communism was no longer perceived as a threat to the West, aka the USA. The visibility of this unity is ultimately what led to the breaking of the last straw between China and the Soviets.
Isn't it true that Mao emphasized similarities between Eastern countries in contrast to Western countries? Couldn't Beijing's involvement in the 1954 and 55 Geneva Conference with India and Burma also be seen as a reflection of Mao's desire for China to be seen as a central force and influence international affairs instead of just as little Moscow's bro?
Yes! finally, it was hard for China and the Soviets to have a genuine partnership because Mao did not truly see the Soviets as the same. In 1958, his views about the differences between Beijing and Moscow's economic situation were revealed by his accusation of Khrushchev trying to establish Soviet power on the coast of the People's Republic of China when they were supposed to be joining forces to halt U.S. intervention in East Asia. Mr. Chen, can you elaborate more on this last straw? What action was taken?
For us to examine this, right, we have to look at some of the context. Countries such as Vietnam, Laos, and Indonesia were trying to hold revolutions in Southeast Asia. China supported these countries from the shadows by sending them supplies and approval. They sent military equipment and other materials to North Vietnam during the height of the Vietnam War. China also supported Indonesia's the new emerging force movement. Besides Asia, China also provided economical, technical, and medical support to African countries that were friendly towards China, such as Mali, Somalia, etc. As China was focused on spreading Chinese centrality, this period would also isolate China from the Soviet Union and India, which caused their tension to rise.
Great answer. So can you continue on how Chinese tensions with India rose in 1959 and how this relates to that last straw that you mentioned before?
Their relationship was very rocky, especially after the Dalai Lama, Tibet's political and religious leader, took refuge in India. Lama was behind the anti-Chinese communist revolt, and him fleeing to India caused the relationship between India and China to fall apart. Then, despite the tensions between India and China, the USSR still gave aid to India in the late 1950s. Because China was already in conflict with India, the fact that the USSR helped their war enemy led to China's relations with the USSR becoming tense.
I agree with the student. I would just like to add that one of the aftermath events is the debate of which country would take the leadership role in the non-Western world in the post-colonial age, which is one of the things that fueled the Sino-Indian tensions. China thought they were better fit because they viewed India as a lackey of Western imperialists. As China solidified their leadership role, they were able to change East Asia into a major battlefield for the Cold War, while also keeping the war cold. In regards to your original question, now that we got the context out of the way, there were also the 1969 border issue that China had that I would consider as the straw.
Oh yeah, I remember learning about this. In the late 1960s, China was pretty isolated and was facing security issues from different directions. The US was closing in on the southern border through their intervention in Vietnam, and Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea from the east. India was approaching from the west, and this is the important part, the Soviets from the northeast.
Yep, you got it spot on. In 1969, the Soviets and China clashed at the border with huge military mobilizations. It was here that China started viewing the USSR as a bigger and more dangerous enemy than the US, hence the shift from the intermediate zone, focusing on class, to the three worlds thesis that focused more on economic development. Because China needed to deal with the USSR as a threat, they collaborated with the US, which is only possible with a shift in framework.
Oh, now I see how all this tension leads to more and more tension, and eventually what basically starts China's disengagement from the Cold War. Then, what happened after China decided to go with the US? How did the US react?
In 1972, Nixon traveled from the US to China and met with Mao. With the Soviet Union and China at odds, Nixon knew it was a perfect timing for the US to swoop in and initiate a collaboration. After this meeting and decision of the Sino-American rapprochement, the US was in a more advantageous position in the Cold War, with only Moscow to focus on. Meanwhile, the Soviets, on the other hand, had two superpowers, both the US and China, against them. Beijing's partnership with Washington resulted in an alteration in the balance of power between superpowers across the globe, aka the decline of the Soviet Union. Beijing's model of Soviet practices, which included capitalist market for reforms, discouraged other third world countries from adopting communism.
Wait, so China started focusing more on economic development?
China was in a difficult place after the Great Leap Forward failed. The Great Leap Forward was a 5-year plan to change the lives of rural Chinese people regarding agriculture.
Oh, I understand. I guess it makes sense that the economy was bad.
It was actually a little bit more complicated than that. As soon as the economy seemed to recover, Mao pushed China back to a stricter international policy under the claim of a revolutionary high tide, one that would supposedly shift the revolution to Beijing. Mao stressed the idea of the possibility that the US imperialists were preparing to wage a war. To further challenge the US and the USSR, Mao focused on international policies around the intermediate zones, especially Southeast Asia.
Back to Nixon. The relationship between the United States and China has had many drastic changes throughout the decades. How has their relationship, or how have these changes affected their involvement in the Cold War?
After Mao and Nixon met in Beijing, their relationship seemed to be taking off for the better. It ended the tension between the PRC and America that lasted for many years, allowing them to prosper together economically.
It also shifted the power in the war, as now America can focus on the Soviets, while the Soviets had to stretch their resources to go against China and the United States.
After Mao's death, Xiaoping became China's new leader, and he prioritized economics over ideologies. He abandoned Mao's goals of class struggle revolution and instead aimed to improve China's economy for the people.
By developing their economic relationship and putting away ideology bias, both China and the United States saw a transformation in the economy, society, and international perception.
Though China started with Mao's strong opinions of the Third World and the Intermediate Zone, these ideas evolved constantly. As China gained and consolidated their leadership in the revolution compared to the USSR or other countries like India, they were able to shift the main location of the battleground for the Cold War to East Asia. Then, to challenge the USSR more as a threatening force, China eventually had several treaties and agreements with the US. This eventually led to China's disengagement from the Cold War and the eventual decline in international communism. We hope that you learned a lot more about the complexities of China's role in the Cold War as a large power.